Crisis? What crisis? Picket killed as lorry is driven from docks. Troopers go from tornado to strike. The nation wins. General strike called off. Thatcher takes over number 10.
Hello and welcome to my second podcast in my series on the winter of discontent. If you haven't listened to the first one, I'd suggest you do this first because this one sort of follows on. So this episode's an interview of Jeff Parker, who was an engineering student in London at the time, so he was there for the binman strikes and the fireman strikes. As we were talking before the interview, he was struggling to remember which strikes were in the winter of discontent because there was just so many strikes in the 70s. After a while we worked out where he was living and how old he was during the winter of discontent, so he could remember which strikes were during that time. So here's the interview and I hope you enjoy it. Do you have any specific memories about the specific winter of discontent, or would you rather talk more generally about strikes?
Well, as I say, the 70s are all blurred into one. The winter of discontent that you're referring to, which was 78, 79, I was living in London and I was halfway through my degree. Mm-hmm. So I was a poor student, focused very much on my studies. Does that sound like a sad story? And the thing I remember about that, more than anything, was that was when the binmen and everything went on strike as well, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And being in London, it wasn't the greatest place, because what we had was mountains of black bags everywhere.
Yeah.
All over the place, absolutely stinking the place up. And I particularly remember one occasion going down Oxford Street. I walked down the length of Oxford Street, and it was getting to the point where they had just about thought about closing the street because there were so many black plastic bags all the way down Oxford Street. Oh, and in those days, Oxford Street wasn't pedestrianised, it was normal traffic, went up and down. But there was so much stuff that people had put out that was spilling over onto the road and blocking the road.
Are there any other strikes that you remember from this time?
Some stage during that period of time as well, we had the oil strikes as well. Was that in the winter of discontent, or was that just before?
I think that was a bit before.
Yeah, and that was a problem as well because that led to all sorts of issues with restricted movement and traffic and what have you. Lots of cars couldn't get fuel.
Do you remember what they did whilst they were trying to maintain order during the strikes?
So one of the things I remember about it was because there were so many problems and everyone was on strike, they got the army in, and because the army's not allowed to strike and they have to do what they're told. So and then there was a big issue that the bin men had lorries for collecting all the rubbish, and if I remember rightly, the army were not allowed to use the bin men's lorries. Yeah. So they had to use their own rubbish lorries. And I didn't realise this at the time, but the army and the Air Force and the Navy have a whole bin collection system, or had a whole bin collection system, so they had all the lorries and everything. And it was very strange because the lorries would go around and they were all this dark, very dark green. They were the same colour as all the army vehicles. And the same thing happened, I remember now, with the firemen went on strike as part of the strike, and I think the ambulances did as well.
Yeah,
and the Army and the Navy and the Air Force had to cover those as well. So then you were seeing, very strangely, Army fire engines on the street. And they, my recollection is they didn't have fire stations, so they would be stationed at some place on the road in London. So you'd walk down somewhere, Regent Street or something, and on the corner of Regent Street there'd be one of these huge, giant, very weird-looking army fire engines, all painted in green, all battle, camouflage, ready and waiting in case a fire broke out. It's a slightly odd thing.
Yeah. So they also had lots of strikes in hospitals, and 1,100 hospitals across the UK were only admitting emergencies for like a month or so.
Oh, I hadn't remembered that. No, I never been to hospital, so I wouldn't know. Seriously, I've never been sick. Nothing wrong with me. I didn't know. I didn't remember that. I knew it was just general chaos and pandemonium.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it wasn't too bad. I jumped on my motorbike or my push bike, and I could get around. But it was. I think it caused a lot of problems for a lot of people.
Did it affect your family at all?
Well, at that stage, my family were still in South Wales, and they wouldn't have been affected in any real way because my dad didn't work at that point. He hadn't worked for many years because he was a miner. He was a retired miner. He'd gone out on sickness problems. So no, it probably wouldn't have affected them down there.
So, because you're a student, you don't really think it would affect you economically at all?
It didn't at the time, no, because I was living right in central London. I could just walk to university, and as a student, we didn't. Well, I certainly, and all the people I was in university with, they paid very little attention to it.
Yeah.
They were all engineers, all engineering students, and they were all focused and concentrating on what they were doing. And I think in some ways, when you're a student, you can go two ways. You can either ignore the rest of the world or get seriously political about it all.
So overall, how great an effect do you think it had on you?
I was in the city. The university kept going. It didn't stop at all. It wasn't slowed down by the process, so all the lecturers could get in. I was probably much more aware of my studies than what was going on around me, apart from the impact on the streets, which was with the bin men being on strike.
Is there anything else you'd like to say about the Winter of Discontent or the effect it had on the UK?
But it was just culminated towards the end of the 70s in just chaos, and I think that's why there was so much political upheaval, because I know there was a whole series of changes of governments over that period, and eventually, people put their foot down. They'd had enough of it. They'd had their guts full of it. And it's interesting. There was quite a backlash against the unions in many ways, and there was a shift towards the Conservative government. And Thatcher came in, and her remit, I think, was we've had enough of this. What's most important is financial control, absolute financial control. And there's no two ways about it. She set out to break the union's stranglehold, as was perceived. And she was very, very ruthless. And that then went into a whole series of strikes, mostly the miners' strikes in the early 80s, which were pretty horrendous. But all of that was in response to what had happened through the 70s, and particularly the late 70s. She didn't ever want a repeat of what had happened. And she succeeded in many ways, because if you think about it now, in 2008, when there was an enormous financial crash, and they said, okay, austerity, no pay increases, or very, very limited pay increases, everyone rolled over and went for it. That would never, ever have happened in the 70s and the 80s. There's no way it could ever have happened. People would have revolted in the streets and they would have kicked government out. But now, because of all of what happened back then, and the fact that she broke a lot of the big unions and broke the spirit of a lot of people, people roll over and do whatever we're told now.
So that was my interview with Jeff on his experiences and views. Next week I'm going to be talking to Keith Page, who was in the Royal Navy and actually worked to replace striking firemen during the Winter of Discontent.